Part 1. The galactic Concord stretched across thousands of star systems, a vast network of species bound by treaties, trade, and uneasy peace. Among its 200 members, humanity was the youngest and the most puzzling. They had joined only 70 years earlier, after barely surviving their own world wars and environmental collapses. Other species admired their speed in rebuilding, their clever machines, and their strange mix of kindness and violence. But few truly trusted them. Humans smiled too wide, spoke too fast, and carried a quiet anger in their eyes that no translator could fully explain. On the edge of conquered space, near the border of the Kavor Dominion, Earth maintained a small diplomatic outpost. It was not grand like the crystalline spires of the Varelians or the floating citadels of the Zenthari. It was simple. Gray metal walls, recycled air, and flickering lights that buzzed like old Earth insects. Here, Ambassador Daniel Cruz spent his days negotiating trade routes, filing reports, and trying to keep human interests from being ignored. He was a calm man with tired eyes and a voice that never rose above a murmur. Beside him stood Kate Morris, Earth's defense liaison. She was younger, sharper, with short brown hair and a habit of tapping her fingers when frustrated. She had seen combat during the Titan border clashes and carried the weight of it in her posture. The Kavor were reptilian, tall and scaled, with eyes like black glass and voices that hissed through translation units. They had been at war with half a dozen species before joining the Concord, and even now, they acted as if peace were a temporary inconvenience. For months, their patrols had drifted closer to human colonies, scanning, probing, testing limits. The Concord Council had been warned. Daniel had filed 3 formal complaints. Each time, the Council responded with the same polite indifference. Historical tensions, they called it. Mutual misunderstandings. Then came the attack on Ceres 7th. It was a mining colony, home to just over 8,000 souls, mostly engineers, teachers, and families who had chosen a quiet life among the asteroids. They had no military presence, only a single security drone and a medical bay. The Kavor struck without warning. Their dropships tore through the thin atmosphere, lasers cutting through domes like paper. The colony's last transmission lasted 17 seconds. In it, a young boy named Leo, no relation to the captain, hid under a table with his sister, whispering, "Mom said they wouldn't come here." Then static. When the news reached the conquered capital, outrage flared, but only briefly. The council convened within hours. Daniel stood at the human podium, his hands steady but his voice shaking. He played the final transmission. He listed the names of the dead. He asked for justice, sanctions, an investigation, anything. The chamber remained silent as the Varelian delegate, a soft-feathered elder named Cheel, rose to support him, but the vote was swift. 198 species declared the attack regrettable but non-escalatory. 2 abstained. Only the Varelians voted with humanity. Kate watched the vote from the observation gallery, her jaw tight. She had known people on Ceres 2nd. A friend from officer training ran the hydroponics lab there. Now she was gone along with everyone else. Back at the outpost, Daniel sat alone in his quarters for 3 hours. When he finally emerged, his face was blank, but his eyes were different. Darker, harder, like stone underwater. On Earth, the reaction was immediate. Protests erupted in every major city. People held candles, waved flags, demanded action. But the world government, led by President Elena Rodriguez, urged patience. "We are part of a larger community," she said in her address. "We must trust the process." Many citizens nodded. Others threw stones at embassy windows. Meanwhile, far from the politics, Captain Leo Harris floated in the command chair of the UNSC's Valiant. The ship was new, barely 6 months out of dry dock, and still smelled of fresh wiring and metal polish. It patrolled the outer rim, watching for smugglers and drifters. Leo was in his late 30s with a scar on his left eyebrow from a training accident and a habit of chewing mint gum when stressed. His crew respected him, not because he shouted, but because he listened. That day, the Valiant received a priority burst from Earth Command. It contained footage of Ceres 7's destruction, raw and unedited. Leo watched it twice. The second time, he didn't blink. His engineer, Maria Santos, stood behind him, arms crossed. She had grown up in a lunar dome and knew what silence after a comms blackout meant. Jake Ellis, the comms officer, kept replaying the boy's voice. Nina Park, tactical lead and former Marine, simply said, "They'll do it again." Leo didn't answer right away. He stared at the star map on the main screen, tracing the Kavor patrol routes with his eyes. Intel had already flagged a buildup near Europa. a medical outpost orbiting Jupiter's icy moon. No weapons, just doctors, nurses, and refugees from a recent solar flare disaster. The Cavor had been scanning it for days. Earth Command's orders were clear. Monitor, report, do not engage. Leo read the message 3 times. Then he turned to his crew. We're not waiting for them to hit Europa, he said quietly. We're going to meet them first. Maria frowned. That's a direct violation of orders. I know, Leo said. But if we wait for permission, Europa becomes Ceres Vevis. Nina nodded. Jake hesitated, then tapped his console. I'll fake a sensor ghost to cover our jump. The Valiant changed course without filing a flight plan. As it slipped into faster-than-light drive, Leo sent one final message. Not to Earth Command, but to a private channel used only by retired officers and old friends. It was short. They took everything but our will. Now you'll see what that's worth. The message bounced through relay stations unnoticed by most, but in hidden corners of human space, in asteroid garages, orbital docks, and underground bunkers, certain people heard it. They didn't reply. They just began to move. Back at the conquered capital, Daniel received a quiet note from the Varelian delegate. Your people are not alone. He folded the note and placed it in his pocket. Outside, the twin suns set behind the council spires, casting long shadows. Somewhere, a ship was flying toward war, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt something other than grief. He felt hope. Part 2. The UNSC's Valiant dropped out of faster-than-light drive just beyond the Jupiter system, its hull humming from the strain. Captain Leo Harris stood on the command deck, eyes fixed on the main display. 3 Cavor warships loomed near Europa's orbit, their jagged silhouettes bristling with weapons. They moved slowly, like predators circling wounded prey. The medical outpost, a cluster of white domes and solar wings, floated helplessly below them, unaware of the danger. Leo didn't hesitate. Maria, reroute auxiliary power to shields. Jake, jam their short-range comms. Nina, target their lead ship's engine array. Non-lethal strike only. His voice was calm, but his fingers gripped the edge of the console. You sure about this, Leo? Maria asked, her hands already flying over the engineering panel. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Once we fire, there's no going back. We passed going back when Series 7 went dark, he replied. The Valiant was smaller than the Cavor cruisers, sleek and fast where they were bulky and armored. It carried no planet-cracking missiles, no plasma cannons, just smart drones, electronic warfare suites, and a crew who knew how to fight dirty. That was the human way, not with brute force, but with tricks, speed, and nerve. Nina locked on. Firing now. A pulse of electromagnetic energy shot from the Valiant's bow, striking the lead Cavor ship just behind its main thrusters. Sparks erupted across its hull. The ship lurched, engines sputtering. Before the other 2 could react, Jake unleashed a swarm of signal ghosts. False readings that made it look like a dozen human ships were emerging from the asteroid belt. The Cavor ships scattered, confused. Good, Leo said. Keep them guessing. For the next 20 minutes, the Valiant danced between the giants. It launched decoy drones that mimicked warship signatures. It bounced radar signals off Jupiter's magnetic field to hide its position. Once it skimmed so close to a Cavor hull that Maria swore she could hear their hissing voices through the metal. Nina disabled a second cruiser by overloading its targeting system with a feedback loop, a trick she'd learned in basic training. The third ship finally locked onto the Valiant and fired. The blast tore through the starboard wing, knocking out 2 thrusters and flooding Deck 4 with coolant. Alarms blared. Leo gripped his chair as the ship shuddered. Report, he barked. Shields at 30%, Maria called. We've lost maneuvering on the right side. Comms are still up, Jake said, blood trickling from his ear. But they're jamming us hard. Nina's voice was grim. They're regrouping. They know it's just us. Leo looked at the screen. The 3 Cavor ships were forming a triangle, closing in. The Valiant couldn't outrun them now, but he hadn't come here to win. He'd come to send a message. Activate the distress pulse, he said. The one tied to the Black Protocol? Jake asked, eyes wide. Yes, Maria froze. That signal goes straight to every human vessel, every station, every hidden relay from Mars to the Kuiper Belt. Once it's out, there's no recall. I know, Leo said. Send it. With a final tap, Jake released the pulse, a coded burst wrapped in emergency frequencies disguised as a standard mayday. But those who knew the old codes would understand. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a call to arms. The Cavor ships opened fire. The Valiant twisted, taking the blasts on its weakened shields. Metal groaned. Lights flickered. Then silence. The main power died. Only emergency reds remained. On the bridge, the crew sat in the dim glow, breathing hard. Outside, the Cavor ships hovered, weapons charged. "They're hailing us," Jake said weakly. Leo stood. "Put it through." The screen flickered to life. A Cavor commander filled the view. Tall, scarred, with eyes like cold oil. "Human vessel," it hissed. "You have fought well for vermin. Surrender. Your deaths will be quick." Leo stepped forward, straightening his uniform. He looked into the camera, not at the alien, but past it, toward every human who might one day see this recording. "You took everything but our will," he said, repeating the words from his earlier message. "Now you'll see what that's worth." Then he turned off the feed. Moments later, the Cavor fired again. The Valiant's hull cracked open like an egg. Oxygen hissed into space. The bridge went dark, but the crew wasn't dead. Not yet. Emergency pods ejected silently, tumbling toward Europa's shadow. Leo's pod was one of them, spinning slowly, its beacon blinking weakly. Inside, he drifted in and out of consciousness, blood on his temple, thinking of the boy from Series 6. He hoped someone had heard the pulse. He hoped it was enough. Back on Earth, the distress signal arrived at UNSC headquarters in Geneva. It bypassed normal channels and triggered an old protocol buried deep in the defense network. Within seconds, lights flashed in secure bunkers beneath the Rockies, the Urals, and the Himalayas. Dormant servers woke. Encrypted files unlocked. Across the solar system, humans who had spent years pretending to be peaceful began to remember who they really were. On Mars, a retired pilot named Carl Reed, once grounded for excessive aggression, received a text on a phone he hadn't used in 10 years. It read, "Valiant down. Europa safe. Code black active." He stared at it for a long time, then walked to his garage, where a rusted flight suit hung on the wall. In the asteroid belt, a civilian freighter named the Iron Mule powered up hidden weapon mounts beneath its cargo bay. Its captain, Lisa Tran, keyed her comms. "All hands prep for unscheduled delivery. Destination: Jupiter." On Titan, a group of engineers working on atmospheric processors paused their work. One of them pulled a panel off the wall and revealed a control switch marked Project Wake Up. Without a word, she flipped it. Meanwhile, in the conquered capital, news of the Valiant's stand reached the council. Some species called it reckless, others called it suicide. But the Varelians played the final transmission in their chamber, and for the first time, even the proudest delegates fell silent. They had seen humans angry before, but this was different. This was not rage. This was resolve. President Elena Rodriguez watched the footage in her office alone. She had spent her career preaching patience, diplomacy, restraint. But now, looking at Leo's face in that last moment, she understood something. Humanity had been holding its breath for decades, and now it had finally exhaled. She picked up the secure line to General Ray Ford. "Initiate Protocol Dawn," she said. "All units. Full mobilization." Ford didn't ask questions. He'd been waiting for this call his whole life. "Yes, Madam President," he replied. "It's about time." As the orders spread, ships began to move. Not in neat formation, not with polished precision, but with purpose. Freighters rerouted. Mining drones armed themselves. Orbital factories switched from building habitats to building hulls. The solar system, long seen as quiet and divided, began to hum with a single low frequency. The sound of a species waking up. And somewhere in the cold dark near Europa, Leo Harris floated in his pod, drifting toward rescue or death. He didn't know which, but he knew one thing for certain. The snap had begun. Part 3, the pulse sent by the Valiant did not fade. It echoed through hidden networks buried deep in old satellites, mining rigs, and even civilian comms relays. Within hours, every human outpost from Mercury's scorched poles to the icy rings of Neptune received the same silent signal. No words, no orders. Just a single encrypted key that unlocked decades of quiet preparation. Humanity had spent years pretending to be fragile, scattered and harmless. Now the mask came off. On Earth, cities emptied not in panic, but in purpose. Construction cranes swung not to build homes, but to lift armored hull plates onto waiting frames. Schools closed, not for fear, but because teachers and students alike reported to defense centers. In underground bunkers beneath Chicago, Berlin, and Shanghai, dormant command nodes flickered to life. General Ray Ford stood in the central war room, maps glowing around him. his voice steady as he directed fleets that most of the world didn't know existed. He had spent 30 years planning for this moment. Not out of hatred, but out of fear that one day no one would listen until it was too late. President Elena Rodriguez addressed the world from Geneva. She wore no ceremonial robes, just a simple gray uniform. "We asked for justice," she said, her voice clear and quiet. "We were given silence. Now we answer not as victims, but as humans." The speech lasted less than 2 minutes. It was replayed a million times before the hour ended. On Mars, retired pilot Carl Reed suited up in a hangar filled with ships that hadn't flown in years. His old fighter, the Red Hawk, sat waiting, its engines purring like a cat remembering its claws. Around him, others did the same, farmers, mechanics, teachers, now pilots again. They didn't shout. They didn't cheer. They just climbed into their cockpits and powered up. In the asteroid belt, Lisa Tran's freighter, the Iron Mule, met up with 5 others. Cargo doors opened to reveal missile racks and point defense turrets. They formed a loose wing, not by rank but by trust. Lisa keyed her mic. "Stay sharp. We're not just hauling ore today." No one replied. They didn't need to. The Cavour, still near Europa, had no idea what was coming. They believed they had crushed a lone ship and scared off the humans. They were wrong. Within 48 hours, human vessels began appearing at the edges of their sensor range. Small, fast, and unpredictable. A Cavour scout vanished near Ganymede. Another reported strange signals that turned out to be drone swarms mimicking meteor showers. Then a supply convoy was ambushed by what looked like civilian tugs, until they fired. The Concorde watched in stunned silence. Their intelligence network scrambled to understand how humanity, long seen as disorganized and politically fractured, could mobilize so fast. They didn't realize that human unity had never been about governments. It was about memory. Every child knew the stories of world wars, of cities burned, of families lost. They had promised never to be helpless again, and now that promise became action. Ambassador Daniel Cruz returned to the Concorde capital not to plead but to observe. He walked through the grand halls where species debated in flowing robes and harmonic tones. Now those halls buzzed with nervous energy. Delegates whispered about human unpredictability and emotional warfare. The Varelians alone remained calm. Chell, the elder delegate, approached Daniel in the garden courtyard. "Your people move like a storm," she said, her feathers ruffling in the artificial breeze. "Not loud at first, but unstoppable," Daniel nodded. "We don't like being pushed." Back in human space, coordination wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. Ships communicated through short bursts, coded in nursery rhymes and old song lyrics to avoid detection. Tactics were shared not by command, but by instinct. A mining drone would lure a Cavour patrol into a debris field, where hidden fighters waited. A medical frigate would broadcast false distress calls, drawing enemies into ambushes. It was messy, chaotic, and utterly effective. The Cavour, used to formal battle lines and honor duels, couldn't adapt. Their commanders demanded clear targets, but the humans gave them none. There was no flagship, no central fleet, just 1,000 points of resistance striking and vanishing. Frustration turned to fear. Reports came in of human boarding parties using sound and light to break Cavour morale, playing recordings of Siri Saveng's last moments inside enemy ships, flashing strobes and rhythms that triggered primal dread. On Titan, the engineers who flipped Project Wake Up now guided fleets through methane storms, using weather as cover. On Venus, cloud stations redirected solar energy to power hidden railguns. Even the moon, long thought peaceful, revealed underground hangars filled with interceptors. Leo Harris was found alive, drifting near Europa. His pod was frost-covered, his body weak, but his mind sharp. He was brought aboard a rescue vessel, the Dawn Runner, captained by a woman named Tina Cole, a former nurse who now flew combat medevac runs. She gave him water and a blanket. "You started something big," she said. "I just lit the match," he whispered. Everyone else brought the fire. As human forces gathered, they did not march on the Cavour homeworld yet. They waited. They watched. They let the fear build. The Cavour began pulling ships back to defend their core systems. Trade routes stalled. Alliances frayed. For the first time, the reptilian species knew what it felt like to be hunted. The Concorde finally called an emergency session. Some species demanded intervention. Others argued that humanity had the right to defend itself. The debate raged for days. In the end, the Council did nothing. They were too afraid to stand with the Kavor and too afraid to stand with humans. That silence was answer enough. On Earth, children drew pictures of the valiant. In Mars colonies, workers sang old war songs while welding hull plates. In every corner of human space, people prepared, not for conquest but for justice. They remembered Series 7, they remembered the boy under the table, and they made sure no one else would have to whisper those words again. The awakening was complete. Humanity was no longer asking for a seat at the table. They had built their own, and the galaxy would soon learn to respect it. But 4. The human fleets did not arrive with fanfare. They came in waves, quiet and relentless, like tides wearing down stone. The first wave struck the outer Kavor colonies, small mining outposts and listening stations. They were disabled, not destroyed. Solar arrays were fried. Comms towers melted, but no lives were taken unless fired upon. It was a message: we can reach you anywhere. The second wave hit harder. Supply lines snapped. Convoys vanished into asteroid fields, only to be found days later, empty and drifting. Kavor warships chasing phantom signals found themselves surrounded by drones that mimicked civilian ships, until they opened fire. Then the drones became weapons, swarming engines and sensor arrays with surgical precision. The Kavor called it cowardice. Humans called it smart. By the time the third wave formed, the Kavor homeworld, Kavorak, was on full alert. Its skies darkened with orbital defenses, its cities dug deep underground. But the humans did not come with a single armada. They came in pieces, freighters with hidden guns, science vessels with jamming tech, even old terraforming ships retrofitted with EMP projectors. They moved like a school of fish, splitting, merging, confusing enemy targeting systems. No one knew where the main force was because there wasn't one. Every ship was the main force. Captain Leo Harris, now recovered and reassigned to tactical command aboard the UNSC's Frontier, watched from orbit as the final phase began. He no longer wore a standard uniform. His jacket was patched, his boots scuffed, and his eyes held the weight of what he'd started. Beside him stood Nina Park, promoted to fleet coordinator, and Jake Ellis, now running electronic warfare for the entire Jupiter sector. Maria Santos was back on the Valiant, repaired, upgraded, and angrier than ever. "They think we're coming to burn their cities," Leo said, staring at the planet below. "But we're not here for revenge. We're here for memory." The plan was simple yet brutal in its clarity. Human forces bypassed military targets entirely. Instead, they focused on the planetary shield grid, a network of towers that protected Kavorak from orbital strikes. Taking them down would leave the world vulnerable, but Leo had no intention of bombing it. He wanted something else. Under cover of a massive feint near the northern pole, a small team of human operatives, led by a former asteroid miner named Ryan Cole, slipped through the atmosphere in stealth pods. They landed near the central relay hub, a massive spire pulsing with energy. Using tools disguised as mining gear, they planted data spikes into the system. Within minutes, they tapped into the Kavor Global Broadcast Network. Back in orbit, Jake initiated the upload. The footage from Series 6, raw, unedited, 17 seconds of a boy hiding with his sister, began playing on every screen on Kavorak. In homes, in schools, in military barracks, in the chambers of the High Council. The message repeated in the Kavor tongue, translated by Varelian linguists who had worked with Daniel Cruz. "You did this, remember." Chaos erupted. Not from explosions, but from within. Kavor citizens, long fed stories of human savagery, now saw the truth. They saw their own ships burning a defenseless colony. They heard a child's voice. For a species that valued honor above all, the shame was unbearable. Protests broke out in the lower cities. Soldiers refused orders. The high command lost control not to weapons but to truth. On the Concord capital world, the council watched in stunned silence. They had expected fire and ruin. Instead, they saw a species brought to its knees by its own conscience. The Varelians wept. Others sat in quiet horror. Even the most skeptical delegates understood. Humans had not come to destroy. They had come to make sure no one forgot. General Ray Ford monitored the situation from Earth Command. When reports came in of Kavor civil unrest spreading, he gave a single order: hold position. No further strikes. He knew the war was already over. The real battle had been for the soul of the Kavor people, and humanity had won without firing a shot on the surface. President Elena Rodriguez addressed the solar system that night. She stood in a plain room, no podium, no flags. "We did not do this to rule," she said. We did it so no child has to hide under a table again. So no silence covers a massacre. If that makes us monsters in your eyes, then so be it. But we will not look away. On Mars, Carl Reed landed his fighter for the first time in weeks. He walked into a bar filled with pilots, all quiet, all tired. No one cheered. They just nodded. They knew what had been done, and why. Lisa Tran's iron mule returned to the belt, its weapons powered down. She sat in her cabin, staring at a photo of her niece on Ceres Fekings. She hadn't cried since the attack. Now she let the tears fall. It wasn't joy. It was release. Leo stood on the observation deck of the Frontier, watching Kvorek's lights flicker as the broadcast looped. He thought of the boy's voice. He hoped it was enough. He hoped it would last. The Kvor High Command sent a surrender signal within 3 days. Not to the Concorde. Not to a general. But directly to Earth. They offered unconditional terms. They would stand trial. They would pay reparations. They would never deny what they had done. Humanity accepted, but only after the Kvor opened their archives, shared their records, and allowed every species in the Concorde to witness the full truth of Ceres II. Justice, Leo realized, wasn't about punishment. It was about memory. As the fleets began to stand down, a new message spread through human channels. Not a code, not a signal, but a phrase, "Remember Ceres." It appeared on ship hulls, in school lessons, in whispered conversations. It was not a threat. It was a promise, and across the galaxy, other small species, those long ignored by the Concorde, began to speak up. They saw what humans had done. They saw that silence could be broken, that the powerful could be held accountable. The reckoning was over, but its echo had just begun. 5 years passed. The scars of war faded, but the memory did not. On Ceres II, where ash once covered the domes, green shoots now pushed through the soil. Trees, genetically hardened to survive the thin air, stood in neat rows planted by hands both human and alien. Children played among them, their laughter echoing where silence had reigned. Some were human. Others were Virelian, their soft feathers catching the sunlight. A few were even young Kvor, sent by families who wanted to learn, not forget. Ambassador Daniel Cruz walked the memorial path every morning. He was older now, his hair more gray than black, but his steps were steady. He stopped at the central stone where the names of the lost were carved. Not just humans, but every life taken that day, including the Kvor soldiers who later confessed they had tried to stop the attack. Justice had been messy, but it had been real. Trials were held. Records were opened. The truth, once buried, now stood in the open like a monument. Kate Morris stood beside him this morning. Her uniform simpler now. Her role changed. She no longer served as defense liaison. Instead, she helped train peacekeepers, humans and others, who patrolled the outer systems not with guns but with open comms and fast ships ready to respond to cries for help. The old ways of the Concorde, where small voices were drowned out by powerful ones, were slowly crumbling, and humanity, once seen as wild and unstable, had become something unexpected, a guardian. On Earth, President Elena Rodriguez had stepped down after 2 terms. She lived quietly in a coastal town, writing letters to schools across the system, reminding them why Remember Ceres mattered. She never gave speeches anymore. She didn't need to. Her words lived in classrooms and ship logs and the quiet choices people made when no one was watching. Captain Leo Harris rarely wore a uniform now. He taught tactics at the Lunar Academy. Not the kind that won battles, but the kind that prevented them. His students came from a dozen species. They argued, laughed, and sometimes cried when they studied Ceres HFY. He never told them what to think. He only asked one question. What would you do if no one was listening? Most didn't answer right away. That was okay. He knew they would carry the question with them. The Unseas Valiant still flew, though it was mostly used for rescue missions now. Maria Santos remained its chief engineer, Jake Ellis its comms lead, and Nina Park its security chief. They took turns piloting it, not because they had to, but because they liked the quiet hum of its engines, the sound of a ship that had once changed everything. The Concorde had offered humanity a permanent seat on its ruling council. They had refused. Instead, Earth proposed something new, the Sentinel Pact. Not an army, not a government, but a network of volunteers, freighters, medics, scouts, and teachers, who watched the dark corners of space where the Concorde rarely looked. They answered distress calls without waiting for votes. They stood with the weak, not because it was easy, but because they remembered what happened when no one did. The Varelians joined first, then the Zinthari. Even a few reformed Kavor enclaves signed on, offering their ships as atonement. The pact had no flag, no capital, no rules beyond one: protect those who cannot protect themselves. It was messy, often underfunded and sometimes late, but it never looked away. On the anniversary of the series' Sefim attack, a ceremony was held at the memorial. Daniel, Kate, Leo, and Elena all attended. So did Carl Reed, Lisa Tran, Ryan Cole, and Tina Cole. They stood in silence as a new tree was planted, a hybrid, grown from earth soil and Varelian spores. A child, no older than the boy from the final transmission, placed a small stone at its base. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Afterward, Leo walked alone to the edge of the colony dome. Beyond the glass, stars glittered in the endless dark. He thought of the moment he'd sent the pulse from the Valiant. He had feared it would start a war. Instead, it had sparked something else, a shift, a wake-up, a promise kept. Humanity had not become conquerors. They had become witnesses. And in a galaxy full of old powers and quiet cruelties, that was enough. Back on Earth, in a small school in Kansas, a teacher played the Series Vect recording for her class. The students sat still. One girl raised her hand. Why didn't anyone help them? She asked. Because they didn't speak up soon enough, the teacher said. But now we do. And so the lesson continued. Across the stars, ships flew with new purpose. Not for glory, not for land, but for the simple idea that no one should suffer in silence. The phrase "Remember Series" was no longer just a warning. It was a compass. It guided choices, shaped laws, and reminded every species, big or small, that courage wasn't about strength. It was about refusing to look away. No species would ever forget the moment when humans finally snapped, not because of the fire they brought, but because of the light they refused to let go out. And in that light, the galaxy found something it had almost lost: hope.